Lama 가서 다 연시사데 지 지주기 미 로마즈 지미기 타네 별주 낭된 추주하게 어째 라선 나바당 야왕 군지 나름 당 르더 지신 로베 담된 추송 카라 그때 람든 시디 영주 타스 문제 무엇이 용줄래
If Tibet is not free, then he will not be reborn in Tibet because it's him who is going to decide where he will be born.
China insists it must have the final say in picking the next Dalai Lama. The Dalai Lama is a revered title, the spiritual leader of Tibetan Buddhism, guiding more than 6 million Tibetans both in exile and inside China.
The Tibetans see him as the living godfather.
He's a very knowledgeable man and he's a great leader.
To the world, he has become a spiritual icon. To China, he is a dangerous separatist.
14世达赖并不是一个单纯的宗教人士，而是一个披着宗教外衣、从事反华分裂活动的政治流亡者。
Communist Chinese troops invaded his homeland 75 years ago, and it controls the region today.
Free Tibet!
Any country in Asia who controls Tibet has a control over whole of Asia.
Now 90, the question of who comes next is on everyone's mind. And what becomes of Tibet when he's gone? The 14th Dalai Lama rolls in a Pope mobile-style golf cart into the courtyard of the main Tibetan monastery in Dharamsala, his adopted home in the Indian Himalayas. This is one of his increasingly rare public appearances. Around him, maroon-robed Buddhist monks and tearful Tibetan exiles chant prayers for his long life. The Dalai Lama is the spiritual leader of more than 6 million Tibetans, both inside Tibet and across the world. But he lives in exile thousands of kilometers from the homeland he fled. Tibet, officially known today as the Tibet Autonomous Region of China. The region's strategic importance is undeniable. But before we get there, it's worth asking, who is this man? Over the last 50 years, the Dalai Lama has become a global icon.
But I really feel oneness of 7 billion human beings. Not much differences. Too much emphasis, my race, my nation, that's to become source of conflict.
He is often compared to Mahatma Gandhi and Nelson Mandela for his message of non-violence. World leaders have lined up to meet him, tech CEOs have sought his advice, and celebrities have praised his wisdom. His long public life has not been without controversy. Still, he's earned a rock star status few modern spiritual leaders achieve, and he's charmed the West along the way.
That is because His Holiness says we have this Buddhist culture.
Penpa Shering is the Sikyong, or the elected political leader of Tibetans in exile.
That is rooted in ancient Indian values of non-violence, ahimsa, karuna, compassion, which has the potential to spread more peace in this world.
The Dalai Lama is also the global face of Tibet's non-violent resistance against China. The Dalai Lama. It sounds like a name, but it is actually a title, one that means ocean of wisdom. For centuries, it has been given to the highest spiritual leader of the Gelug school of Tibetan Buddhism. The man who holds it today is the 14th in this unbroken line of reincarnated lamas believed to be reborn again and again to guide Tibetans. The 14th Dalai Lama was born as Lamo Thondup in 1935 in a remote village in northeastern Tibet. At the age of just 2 years, he was identified as the reincarnation of his predecessor. By 5, he was on the throne presiding over Tibet's political and spiritual leadership. In 1950, Chinese troops from the People's Liberation Army invaded Tibet. A year later, under pressure, Tibetan representatives were forced to sign the 17-point agreement recognizing Chinese sovereignty in return for promises of Tibet's autonomy. The Dalai Lama ratified the agreement but later repudiated it, but that was enough for China to claim its control over Tibet.
Tibet and allow the Chinese, the PLA to come in.
Lai Hongyi is professor of international relations at the University of Nottingham.
For a short while, have smooth or at least peaceful relations with the central government, including the leader Mao Zedong himself. But then later on, they kind of fell apart.
Some Tibetans contend it is here where the issue lies.
There was only one agreement that was signed between the Communist Party and the Tibetan government in 1951. And that was also forced upon us under the threat of war, that if we don't sign, then we would be attacked violently and they call it the liberation of Tibet.
China promised Tibet autonomy, religious freedom and respect for its traditional system. But in the years that followed, Tibetans claimed that Chinese troops had tightened military control, closed Buddhist monasteries, took more control of Tibetan cultural institutions and restricted religious activities. Between 1956 and 1959, resistance intensified, culminating in a full-scale uprising in Lhasa, the Tibetan capital. In 1959, the Dalai Lama fled Lhasa in disguise, escaping through a Himalayan pass. He crossed into India and was granted asylum. He set up Tibetan government in exile in Dharamsala. Beijing accuses the Dalai Lama of promoting secessionism. His image is still banned in Tibet today.
在西藏问题上，中方的立场是一贯的、明确的。达赖说什么、做什么，改变不了西藏繁荣发展的客观事实。我们希望有关方面不要给这种分裂中国的言论提供平台。
Separate Tibetan identity, including language and religious Buddhist knowledge, they consider source of threat of separation. So accordingly, they really carry systematic policy. In many areas, they restriction study Tibetan.
Between 1987 and 1989, Tibetan protests rocked Lhasa again, prompting China to impose martial law. In a speech to the US Congress, the Dalai Lama called for a dialogue between Tibetan representatives and Beijing. His plan did not call for independence, but for genuine autonomy and peaceful coexistence with the People's Republic of China.
His Holiness expected a more favorable response from the Chinese government, which was not forthcoming at that time.
In 1989, the Dalai Lama was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for his non-violent struggle for Tibetan autonomy.
Any relationship between Tibet and China will have to be based on the principle of equality, respect, trust, and mutual benefit.
And many Tibetans, including monks, nuns and lay people, have immolated themselves across Tibet as a drastic form of protest against Chinese rule.
Why the self-immolation of 161 Tibetans who have self-immolated against the Chinese government?
Tenzin Ladon is a researcher at the Tibet Policy Institute in India.
Why do people still protest against the dam construction that you are building for the benefit of the for the benefit of the local Tibetans?
And then in 2009, China cut off all official dialogue with Tibetans in exile. By 2011, the Dalai Lama had stepped down from political leadership and handed it to the head of Tibetan government in exile.
If you look at what Xi Jinping is doing to the whole of China, and particularly to Tibet, to Uyghurs or to Mongols, right now, since he came to power in 2013, his whole idea is to eliminate the identity of what they call as nationalities. So their thinking is that if there are no nationalities, then there are no nationality issues. So they are striking at the very root of the identity of all the nationalities, whether it's to do with the Tibetans, Mongols or Uyghurs.
There have been growing reports of mass surveillance, forced assimilation and repression in Tibet, ranging from facial recognition in monasteries to tightened control over religious and cultural expression. This has sparked international concern and human rights criticism.
Each and every day they are closing all the Tibetan schools.
Serkong Shenhab Rinpoche is a Tibetan High Lama in exile.
And the young children of the Tibetan kids, they are forced to go to join the military.
Now the 14th Dalai Lama is 90. The world celebrates his legacy, but behind the reverence lies a pressing question. What will happen to Tibet after him? To answer that, we first examine as why Tibet is so important and why China wants to control it. This is Tibet, officially called Tibet Autonomous Region. It is also called the third pole of the world because it is home to the largest reserves of fresh water outside the North and South poles. Glaciers here feed Asia's major rivers, the Yarlung-Zangpo, the Yellow and the Yangtze in China, and the Indus, the Sutlej, the Ganges, the Brahmaputra, the Irrawaddy, the Salween, and the Mekong, all fed from the Tibetan Plateau, supplying 2 billion people downstream in South and Southeast Asia alone. Much of Tibet is at 4,000 meters above sea level or higher, and it has an area of 1.2 million square kilometers. That's about 1/8 of China's total landmass.
Any country in Asia who controls Tibet has a control over whole of Asia.
China is building massive military and transportation infrastructure in Tibet, airports, roads, and high-speed rail to connect it with the rest of the country.
It's seen Tibet as part of China and should be economically integrated, benefited from so-called motherland. Given its quite tiny, small share population and economy in the Western region, it has probably got a disproportionately really high investment from the central government.
Tibet is getting a massive makeover. 80 billion yuan or 9.5 billion euros for new airports, upgraded rail lines and highways.
One of the highest altitude rail line in the world would take passengers from the nearby provinces, and that have been a quite popular train ride for many tourists.
China is rapidly expanding a Tibetan superhighway network with plans for over 5,600 kilometers of high-grade highways by 2035. In addition, China is building the world's largest hydropower dam on the eastern edge of the Tibetan Plateau, tapping the mighty Yarlung-Zangpo River. When completed, it could generate 300 billion kilowatt-hours a year, but the ripple effect may reach millions downstream.
Almost 1/3 of the world's populations are dependent on the water that comes from Tibet.
Lobsang Yangso is an exiled Tibetan environmental researcher.
The people who are dependent on the Brahmaputra river and the Mekong are the fishermen, the farmers, and their livelihoods get hugely impacted.
China is also digging deep in Tibet, literally. Tibet holds about 85% of China's known lithium reserves, making it a key player in the global electric vehicle boom.
Tibet has a huge mineral resources. The rare earth minerals that are found in Tibet.
All of this development has brought more Han Chinese to Tibet. While the most recent census shows ethnic Tibetans remain the overwhelming majority of the population in the Tibet Autonomous Region, the Han Chinese population has steadily increased in recent decades. Han Chinese make over 21% of Lhasa's population, but independent observers estimate the figure to be significantly higher. Because Tibet is so strategically and geopolitically significant, the ruling Chinese Communist Party insists China has the final say in choosing the next spiritual leader in Tibet.
The whole world was shocked when China says we have the authority to decide the reincarnation, who decides the reincarnation of His Holiness Dalai Lama.
Beijing says picking the next Dalai Lama is based on the 2007 regulations on religious affairs.
签认定中央政府批准14世达赖本人就是在13世达赖喇嘛圆寂之后。
The Golden Urn? We'll explain that a bit later.
China today in Tibet faces legitimacy crisis, And that is why the question is, why is the role of Dalai Lama so important for them to select that they need to select the next Dalai Lama? Is because they know who is the true leader.
Beijing wants to be able to answer that, but the current Dalai Lama has some thoughts on the matter.
So I may, time of dying, I may determined to reborn among Tibetan community.
Because His Holiness keeps saying, I'll be born in a free world. If Tibet is not free, then he will not be reborn in Tibet, because it's him who's going to decide where he will be born.
Traditionally, the selection of the Dalai Lama follows an ancient Tibetan Buddhist practice rooted in the belief in rebirth. Senior lamas and monks search for a young child believed to be the reincarnation of the previous Dalai Lama, guided by visions, omens and tests.
How we found the 14th, the great 14th, it is one of his previous life student who's the regent of the Tibet, who has the full authority to find His Holiness. And he has the pure vision that the 3 syllables were there, Akama.
In the traditional process, the chosen child must recognize the belongings of the previous Dalai Lama and demonstrate signs of spiritual continuity. But there is also the golden urn, introduced in 1793 as a lottery system to select reincarnated lamas. It was meant to assert imperial control, but Tibetans reject its use. In 1995, the current Dalai Lama named Gedun Choki Nima as the 11th Panchen Lama, the second highest authority in Tibetan Buddhism. Shortly after, Chinese authorities forcibly disappeared Gedun, his family, and key members of the search committee. Ever since, their fate has been a mystery.
And now I guess he's around 30 years old. And we still don't know about him. Where is he? His whereabouts.
Nagavung Ludup Shering is a Tibetan who has spent his entire life in India.
Only thing we know is that China took him over. He might be killed, he might be alive, we don't know.
That same year, China named its own Panchen Lama using the golden urn. So will China use the golden urn to name its own Dalai Lama?
If they end up, say, being 2 candidates, or they end up disagreeing on who eventually become the Dalai Lama, new Dalai Lama, 15 Dalai Lama, yes, that would be a big issue. Beijing may not be even be able to accept the person if she is from outside China.
Tibet sits at the crossroads of Asia's most sensitive geopolitical fault lines. No country, not even India, officially recognized Tibet as an independent country or acknowledged the Tibetan government in exile, but some do engage with the current Dalai Lama. His global influence can complicate diplomacy, particularly for India, where he has lived since 1959, and for the US, where Tibet has featured in the broader set of issues with China. China's growing military footprint in the region and the presence of the Dalai Lama in India make a tense situation between the nuclear-armed neighbors even more precarious. Given how those tensions have flared in the past, a debate over who succeeds the current Dalai Lama could make things even more volatile.
That kind of dynamic actually play out, make the border area in Tibet is more important, because both, given the rising nationalism in their own backyard, do not want to yield easily to each other. So it makes Tibet a more important focal point for China.
Beijing's claim over India's Arunachal Pradesh, which it refers to as South Tibet, is also a thorny issue. But as China's influence grows, fewer nations seem willing to make the Tibet a point of contention. And the Dalai Lama's age and his lower visibility on a global stage is also a factor.
From Beijing point of view, they will see that, yes, it has been kind of put in a negative way, it's a headache. But it's not the worst headache for now. Thanks to many ways to Dalai Lama himself. Obviously, the Beijing may have a slightly different interpretation, meaning compare him to like Xinjiang, some of the radical group. Dalai Lama have been more pushing for peaceful resolution.
Back-channel talks between China and Tibetan envoys have stalled since 2009 with no meaningful progress.
younger Tibetans who are feeling frustrated because anything that we have done is not or has not produced the result that we would want.
For now, maintaining the status quo serves both China's interest and its control over Tibet. The majority of Tibetans inside Tibet have never met the 14th Dalai Lama, and many in exile have never set foot in their homeland. Every Wednesday, Tibetans in exile in India dance, not just for joy, but to remember, resist, and stay rooted. Meanwhile, the 14th Dalai Lama made it clear what should happen when he is gone. The two sides have drawn clear lines on who picks the next Dalai Lama. This outcome will determine Tibet's fate.